And we then pay interest on on the money that we immediately gave away for the rest of the year, and probably long afterwards. Israel makes interest on it. They don't spend it all that first day. They spend it throughout the year. Most aid abroad is done monthly or quarterly. There is oversight. There are strings attached. Not with Israel. That's another unique aspect about this very special relationship with Israel. The history and context of this, I'll tell more about some of that later, but I'd like to just briefly tell about the history of Israel-Palestine, because most of us don't know it. Many people in this room might, but I certainly did not. I've therefore read many, many books on this issue from diverse authors, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, secular, American, British, European, Israeli. When you do that, you learn that the facts are not difficult to determine. They're not difficult. Some aspects are, but the overall outline is very clear. The first thing I learned is that when I was born, there was no Israel. So where did the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if there wasn't even Israel when I was born? Well, you don't go back thousands of years the way we are through our manipulative coverage being led to believe, because you will go back to Palestine at the turn of the century, the early 1900s, late 1800s, and you discover that Palestine was there as a region, not as a country, as a region, under the Ottoman Empire. At that time, it was, as it had been for centuries, without violence. It was a multicultural land with 15% were Christian, about 80% were Muslim, about under 5% were Jewish, all practicing their faiths on land that is very holy and sacred to all three of those faiths. So what happened? They were not fighting. You can check the history on this. So what happened? Well, to understand that, you don't have to go back in history. You go to Europe, where you find there is a political ideology. And like many ideologies, it is fanatic. Ideologies tend to be. I'm not a big fan of them. So, in this case, this was called political Zionism. They wanted, now part of it, to me, sounds reasonable and acceptable. They wanted a Jewish state somewhere in the world. They felt that they should have that, just like gypsies perhaps would like one as well. There are many groups that would probably like that as well. So that was their goal, was to have a Jewish state somewhere in the world. They considered Uganda and Argentina. They considered parts of North America for such a state. They were not religious. The originators of political Zionism were far from religious. Most were agnostics or outright atheists. But they knew that there could be a propaganda value if they put the Jewish state in Palestine, because there were real biblical connections from 2,000 years before for that. So they decided that they would use Palestine as the place to create a Jewish state. Again, look at the history and you discover that for the Jewish population in Palestine was highly opposed to Zionism. They considered it heretical. The religious Jews around the world considered it heretical because the disbursement, the diaspora, had been at God's will because of violating God's commandments and was only supposed to be done by God, not by a political movement such as this. Therefore, it was a very fringe movement for a number of decades, very small, very fringe movement, but they began to move to Palestine to create a state that would be unfriendly, to put it mildly, to 95% of those inhabitants, in which they would basically be pushed out, so that an exclusionary kind of state could be created. There was, not surprisingly, as this type of colonization increased, there began to be violence from the indigenous people against their dispossession and by the colonists who wanted to get rid of the indigenous people, Christians and Muslims. Then as now, their innocent lives lost everywhere over this, most of them the indigenous population got killed in far greater numbers. When the Nazis came to power in Europe, there was still more immigration. There were the atrocities, the Nazi Holocaust occurred, etc. There was still more immigration to Palestine, and therefore the conflict between the colonists and the indigenous people increased as well and became more and more violent. So jumping ahead to after World War II, the British now were in charge of Palestine. The Ottoman Empire had been defeated in the First World War, shenanigans. So Britain had been in charge of Palestine. It was under the British Empire. Then the British, because of all the violence there, much of it directed at the British Empire itself, especially there was a lot of Zionist terrorism, especially against the British, against the Palestinians and the British. So the British finally just gave up and decided to turn the question. They didn't want the mandate anymore. They were going to leave, and they turned the question of Palestine over to the United Nations to solve. The United Nations, at considerable pressure, and I'll get into this in a few minutes, decided the General Assembly recommended a partition plan in which 55% of Palestine would be given away to this immigrant group, the colonists. It would be a Jewish state. So that meant that the indigenous inhabitants would be getting 45% of their own land. Americans would not jump at that wonderful compromise, as it was called, and neither did the Palestinians. Especially when, again, this is often portrayed, I can give you all the Zionist talking points. What they tend to say is, well, the Zionists bought up all of this land. No, they didn't. They tried to. That's the way you can dispossess people if you're rich. You can go to poor people and maybe buy their land and get rid of them that way. That attempt was made. It was often financed by the Rothschild family of Europe, for example. So they had a lot of money at their disposal. However, they failed. They did buy up a lot of land that they had not previously held. Originally, Jewish ownership was about 1% because it was largely centered in just a few places, very urban. After decades of attempts, they had bought up at most 8% of the land. Most historians say 5 to 6% of the land was Jewish ownership. So a group that owned at most 8% was getting, according to this proposal, was going to get the bigger half. They also, even after decades of immigration, only made up 30% of the population. So, this was actually not the compromise that many people think it was. It was an absurd proposal. And yet the Zionists, in the pressure that was brought to bear on the United Nations, made it look like it was going to happen. And therefore there was outright warfare. It's called by the Israelis, this is called the War of Independence. But independence from whom? It's unclear because the British were already giving it up. And the Palestinians call it the catastrophe, al-Nakba, because it was a massive humanitarian catastrophe. Over 750,000 men, women, and children were pushed off their land. It was probably closer to 800,000 at least. Were quite ruthlessly pushed off their land. There were numerous massacres. This is a partial list of them. This is 33. There were more than that, but these I just had easily at hand. 16 of these occurred before a single Arab army joined this war to try to come in on the side of the Palestinians, by the way. 16 massacres before a single Arab army was part of this. And even when the Arab armies did join in, they were smaller in number. The people under arms and the weaponry was smaller in number than the Israeli forces. So at the end of that, they had taken over 78% of Palestine, and the Palestinians were down to 22% of their land. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip are the official name is the Palestinian Occupied Territories. These are not part of Israel. They are sometimes portrayed that way. Google Maps, bizarrely, puts them all as part of Israel. They are not. They are separate entities. They are not officially part of Israel. The Golan Heights up in the northern part there, Israel annexed, which is also illegal. So even though that is also claimed as part of Israel, that is not a part of Israel, that's occupied Syria. Israel itself does not, even Israel itself admits that the West Bank and Gaza Strip are not part of Israel. So I don't know why Google Maps does that. Now I'm going to get into the section that I don't usually get into, but I just think it's such important information that I'm going to go into this a little bit, which is the history of the U.S. relations. Because as I mentioned, we have what is called the special relationship with Israel. And there's a great deal of discussion, well, why do we have it? What drives it? Is it the military-industrial complexes? Is it the lust for empire that has driven many American actions? Is this what drives this particular one? And when you study it thoroughly, you discover, no. It is special interest lobbying that has driven this from the start. So let me just go through a little bit of this because I find it very significant when I've read it. I'm just giving a little bit of it sort of in the middle of a bigger lecture, but basically the lobby, the Israel lobby, was around since about 1912. I can tell you about the First World War, etc., but I'll skip that. We'll just get to when it really became more significant. It was already significant, though, because it played a role in the U.S. entering World War I. But in the 1940s is when it became especially significant. So there was this lobby created on behalf of a foreign entity, before it existed, but on behalf of Zionism. In 1943, this precursor to what the Israel lobby is called today had $500,000. Back in those days, that's just was an astronomical sum of money. This was what a nickel bought a loaf of bread. So, they had a massive amount of money. And they decided to use this massive amount of money to capture the support of congressmen, clergy, Christian clergy, editors, professors, businesses, and labor. That's what they did with this money. They started targeting every sector of the United States. They still do this today. They were told that their first point was to talk to Congress people, but they were also targeting union members, Jewish war veterans. They were providing them letters to write. They were telling them where their lectures, much the way they do today. Often when I go places, there are people who have already been brought in to oppose what I'm saying. So they were already doing this back in the 40s. They created chaff organizations around the country to work on behalf of Zionism, a very anti-American, very un-American type of ideology, yet they had 400 local committees doing that. They revived some, quote, Christian Protestant organizations and basically funded certain people that would teach this very strange dispensationalist ideology that's very different than the Christianity I learned, but they worked to take over some Christian churches and Christian theology. It's just astounding. They gave $150,000 to this one particular group. They bought Jerry Falwell, a jet plane. Therefore, fundamentalist American Christian preachers who would preach that all Jews are supposed to go back to Palestine, and this will bring a horrible rapture in which people kill each other, and that somehow brings back Jesus, the Prince of Peace. Any fundamentalist preacher that would teach that bizarre teaching was given prominence. If you can get on TV, you're charismatic, you have a jet plane to fly you around, you have radio stations playing your charismatic speeches, you can be very influential, and they became very influential. Whereas fundamentalist Christian preachers who were also very fundamentalist on all of these things, but who knew that that was unchristian, untheological, bizarre, and deeply wrong, did not get jet planes, are not on TV, do not have radio stations, nobody hears them except their little congregation in Oregon, for example, or in Georgia, for example. So that Christianity in the United States itself was manipulated by Zionism. And somebody who grew up as a Christian, I'm appalled at what I've discovered went on. This isn't more about that. So basically, it was an enormous manipulation of this country by people with an ideology that was to create a Jewish state in Palestine. I'll skip through some of this if we have time afterwards. I'll tell about the State Department. Well, maybe I won't skip it. Because, again, the Pentagon and the State Department opposed supporting Zionism. They opposed it almost universally because it would be damaging to the United States and was also antithetical to American principles. So this is, for example, Lloyd Henderson was a very high-level State Department official. He sent a long memo about Zionism, about why not to support Zionism, why not to push the partition recommendation to the Secretary of State. And he said, quote, support by the government of the United States of a policy favoring the setting up of a Jewish state in Palestine would be contrary to the wishes of a large majority of the inhabitants. Furthermore, it would have a strongly adverse effect upon American interests throughout the Near and Middle East. talking about the 1940s. This is an expert in the U.S. State Department saying, the U.S. has a moral prestige in the Near and Middle East unequaled by that of any other great power. We would lose that prestige and would likely for many years to be considered as a betrayer of the high principles which we ourselves have enunciated during the period of the war. He issued another memorandum because the whole time he was doing this, Zionists were pushing the U.S. to push the partition recommendation. So he, again, the State Department and the Pentagon were saying, don't do this. He was saying, I feel it again to be my duty to point out that all the members of my office acquainted with the Middle East, that the policy we are following in New York at the present time, that's with the partition plan, is contrary to the interests of the United States and will eventually involve us in international difficulties of so grave a character that the reaction throughout the world, as well as in this country, will be very strong, and it is quite clear that there will be wide-scale violence in that country. He was correct. They tried to get him fired and almost succeeded. So anyway, there's much more on that that we can maybe talk about now, but nobody knows these facts because when you are influential in the media, you control what people know. It's that simple. Or what people think they know. So, after the Six-Day War, in which Israel then attacked attacked its neighbors again, they began moving their population onto territories that were not their territory. This is illegal under international law. Therefore, when you hear about Israeli settlements, in reality, these are illegal, Jewish-only colonies that are using our money to exist. The reason I say Jewish-only is because some Israeli citizens are Christians and Muslims. A certain section, a certain number of people who originally lived in Palestine were not ethnically cleansed all the way outside of what are now the borders of Israel. They were pushed out of their villages usually and hidden, they would hide somewhere or go someplace else and hide. But after the war sort of stopped, they came out and they were still inside the borders of Israel. They are what Israel calls the Israeli Arabs. That's what Israel calls them. They're actually Palestinians, and they are about 20% of the country. They don't have full citizenship. They are discriminated against systematically in numerous ways. And one of the ways is that these red dots, they're not allowed to go there. These are only Jewish settlements. So that's why I try to be precise in the way I use the words. The red dots on the Gaza Strip, down the lower left there, are no longer there. Those illegal colonies were removed about 5 or so years ago. That was well covered by the media. We saw Israeli settlers weeping as they were leaving their homes, without being informed those homes were on stolen land, and most people would not be expected to be able to keep stolen land, but they expected to. So there was a great sympathetic portrayal of what was really just finally adhering to international law. Now, when we saw weeping people, we didn't see weeping parents in the West Bank whose children were killed during that same period. I believe 1 or 2 were killed right during that period, but they weren't mentioned by the LA Times, for example. Also, what we were not told is that while they decreased the number of settlements in Gaza, they were removed, they increased the number in the West Bank during that period. So the number of illegal settlements occupying Palestinian land actually increased during a period that we thought they were decreasing. So there was very strange coverage of that issue.